Welcome now. Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. I should have known better than to trust the unnaturally still surface of Lake Morrison. As a nature photographer, I've learned to read the subtle signs of danger in the wilderness, but my eagerness to capture the perfect shot of the winter thaw clouded my judgment. My name is Florinda Martinez, and I'm writing this as a warning to anyone considering taking their ARV to the Adirondacks during the late winter months. The Airstream Atlas handled the winding mountain roads beautifully that afternoon, its sleek silver body reflecting the pale February sun. I'd spent months planning this trip, waiting for that perfect moment when winter begins to lose its grip on the mountains. The ranger station was empty when I arrived. With only a handwritten note about reduced staffing during the off-season, I should have recognized that first red flag. The camping spot I found seemed almost too perfect. A cleared area overlooking the frozen lake, surrounded by towering pines heavy with snow. As I set up my camera equipment, I noticed how the ice seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it, creating dark patches that seemed to shift when viewed through my telephoto lens. At the time, I dismissed it as an interesting optical phenomenon worth photographing. That first evening, I settled into my Airstream's cozy interior, reviewing the day's shots on my laptop. Something about the images made me uneasy, particularly one that captured a series of concentric circles in the ice. Like ripples frozen in time, I zoomed in trying to understand what I was seeing when I heard it. A deep, resonating crack that seemed to come from the lake's depths. The sound wasn't like normal ice breaking. It was more like something breaking out of the ice. I grabbed my camera and tripod, thinking I might capture the natural process of the thaw beginning. The temperature reading on my weather station showed 31 Thaw, just barely below freezing. As I stepped outside, the motion-activated lights on my RV illuminated the shoreline, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. Scattered across the newly exposed patches of shore were strange, iridescent fragments that looked like broken shell or chitin, each piece larger than my hand. But it was the pattern they formed that terrified me. They were arranged in a perfect spiral, pointing directly at my RV, and they definitely hadn't been there when I parked. I rushed back inside my Airstream, hands shaking as I locked the door. The rational part of my mind tried to explain away what I'd seen. Maybe local kids playing pranks, or debris revealed by melting snow. But deep down, I knew better. There hadn't been any footprints in the snow around the spiral, and those shell-like fragments had seemed to emit a faint, phosphorescent glow in the darkness. That's when the first problems with the RV started. The temperature inside began dropping rapidly. Despite the heater running at full blast, I checked the propane levels. Still nearly full, the Airstream's sophisticated systems were all reporting normal operation. Yet I could see my breath misting in the air, even stranger. The cold seemed to be emanating from the windows facing the lake, as if something out there was actively drawing the heat away. I tried calling the ranger station, but my cell phone showed no signal. Unusual, since I'd had perfect reception just an hour earlier. The Airstream satellite system was also down, leaving me completely cut off from the outside world. The only sound was the increasing frequency of those deep, resonating cracks from the lake, now accompanied by what sounded almost like whispers carried on the wind. My camera's memory card might have evidence of whatever was happening, so I connected it to my laptop. The most recent images were corrupted, except for one. The photo of the concentric circles in the ice now showed something I hadn't seen before. A dark mass beneath the surface, its edges perfectly aligned with the circles above. The image's metadata was corrupted, displaying impossible numbers for temperature and GPS coordinates. Around midnight, the motion-activated lights outside began triggering randomly, illuminating swirling snow that seemed to move against the wind. Each time they came on, I caught glimpses of more spiral patterns in the snow, each one larger and closer to my RV. The shells or fragments I'd seen earlier appeared to be multiplying, their ghostly glow intensifying with each passing hour. The worst part was the scratching sound that began on the RV's roof. Light at first, like ice falling, but gradually becoming more deliberate. Just before dawn, the scratching suddenly stopped. In the deafening silence that followed, my Airstream systems came back online all at once. Lights flickering, heater roaring, satellite radio bursting with static. Through the white noise, I heard something that made my skin crawl, a garbled voice speaking words that sounded ancient and wrong, repeating one phrase over and over. When I played it back on my phone's recording app and slowed it down, I finally understood what it was saying. The ice preserves, the ice contains, the ice breaks. The first light of dawn revealed a transformed landscape that made me question my sanity. The clearing around my Airstream was now completely encircled by those spiral patterns, and the shell-like fragments had multiplied into hundreds, forming intricate geometric shapes that seemed to pulse with an inner light. The ice on the lake had developed a web of glowing cracks that formed the same repeating patterns I'd seen on shore. My instincts screamed at me to drive away immediately, but when I tried starting the Airstream, the engine made a horrible grinding sound before dying completely. The electrical systems flickered erratically, and the temperature inside plummeted to freezing within minutes. Through the windshield, I watched in horror as frost patterns began forming on the glass. Not random crystals, but precise mathematical formations that looked almost like writing. The lake ice was melting at an impossible rate now, steam rising from the surface despite the freezing temperature. Through my camera's zoom lens, I could see dark shapes moving beneath the thinning ice, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The shapes seemed to respond to my attention, gathering beneath the area where I was watching, pressing up against the weakening barrier between us. A violent impact rocked my RV, nearly knocking me off my feet. Something had struck the undercarriage with enough force to tilt the entire vehicle. The motion-activated lights triggered, revealing nothing beneath the Airstream but a growing pool of water that definitely shouldn't have been liquid at this temperature. As I watched, the water began moving against gravity, flowing upward along the RV's sides in those same spiraling patterns. The radio crackled to life again, but this time I heard something different. A transmission that seemed to be coming from the ranger station. Through the static, I made out fragments of an emergency broadcast. Ancient ice, containment protocols, multiple breaches. Do not approach the water. Repeat, do not. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by that same otherworldly voice from before, now accompanied by sounds that resembled singing but were somehow horribly wrong. I grabbed my emergency bag and camera, knowing I had to document whatever was happening, even if I didn't survive to share it. Through the Airstream's rear window, I saw something emerging from the lake. Something massive and geometrically impossible. Its surface covered in the same iridescent material as the fragments I'd found. As it rose higher, I realized with growing horror that the spiral patterns weren't a warning. They were a template, showing these things how to arrange themselves to create something much, much larger. The thing rising from the lake defied every natural law I knew. Its surface shifted between solid and liquid states, the iridescent shells flowing like mercury before crystallizing into rigid geometric patterns. I had only seconds to act as the creature's mass began flowing toward my Airstream, its movements creating that same awful singing sound I'd heard on the radio. My years of wilderness survival training kicked in, and I grabbed my emergency flares. The temperature had dropped so low that my breath instantly crystallized, forming tiny spiral patterns in the air before my eyes. As I fumbled with the flare, I noticed something terrifying. The crystals weren't dissipating, but rather joining together, building complex structures that reached toward me like tiny, frozen fingers. The entity from the lake seemed to be controlling the very moisture in the air, turning my own exhalations into weapons against me. Through my viewfinder, I captured images that my mind could barely process. The creature wasn't just one being, but thousands of smaller entities working in perfect synchronization. Like a swarm of iridescent insects made of living ice, they were using the spiral patterns as some kind of blueprint, gradually assembling themselves into a form that kept changing. Every time I tried to focus on it, the photos on my camera's display showed impossible geometries that made my head spin. A deafening crack split the air as the lake's entire surface began to rise. More of the entities were emerging, each one adding to the impossible structure taking shape before me. The airstream's metal skin groaned as the temperature continued to plummet, frost patterns spreading across its surface like hungry vines. I realized with horror that the RV wasn't just being frozen. It was being systematically dismantled at a molecular level, its structure being repurposed by these beings. The emergency flare finally ignited, casting an eerie red glow across the scene. The heat seemed to confuse the entities momentarily, their synchronized movements becoming erratic. I used this opportunity to reach for my satellite phone one last time, and miraculously, it connected. A calm voice answered immediately, as if they'd been waiting for my call. "Ms. Martinez, this is Dr. Chen from the Containment Division. We've been monitoring the breach. Whatever you do, don't let them complete the spiral pattern if all the pieces align." The call cut off as something punctured the airstream's roof, a crystalline appendage that moved with deliberate intelligence. As it reached toward me, I saw my own reflection fractured across its surface countless times, each image showing a different version of my face frozen in terror. The entities weren't just trying to capture me, they were trying to make me part of their pattern. And in that moment, I understood why all those spirals had been pointing at my RV. They hadn't been hunting me, they'd been studying me, learning my structure, preparing to make me into something else entirely. The crystalline appendage retracted suddenly as my flare's heat intensified, leaving behind a perfectly geometric hole in the airstream's roof. Through it, I could see the entities assembling themselves into a vast lattice that was beginning to arch over my RV. The structure seemed to pulse with a cold blue light that grew brighter with each new pattern they formed. My camera's display was now showing impossible readings. 273, 15 degrees C. Absolute zero. They were trying to recreate something. I realized with growing horror, each new spiral pattern they formed was more complex than the last. And they were using my RV, and soon me, as raw material for their construction. The strange fragments I'd first seen were just preliminary sketches. Now they were ready to create their masterpiece, and I was going to be their medium. Through the windows, I watched as parts of my airstream began to crystallize and break apart, each piece rising to join their expanding structure. Dr. Chen's warning about the spiral pattern suddenly made sense. These entities weren't just building randomly, they were following a specific blueprint, one that had been locked in the ice for who knows how long. Each new piece they added made the pattern more complete, and I could feel reality itself beginning to warp around me. The laws of physics were breaking down as their structure grew closer to completion. My own breath now froze instantly into complex crystalline structures that tried to merge with my skin. In my desperation, I remembered something from my university physics classes about crystalline structures and resonance frequencies. The entities seemed to communicate through that awful singing sound. What if I could disrupt their harmony? I still had my audio equipment in my emergency bag, including a portable speaker I used for wildlife calls. With trembling hands, I connected it to my phone and pulled up a frequency generator app. The entities had almost completed their pattern now, and I could feel myself being pulled toward the geometric hole in the roof. My fingers were beginning to crystallize, beautiful fractal patterns spreading across my skin like living frost. The cold was so intense that the air itself was solidifying, forming sheets of impossible ice that flowed upward against gravity. Through the crystalline walls forming around me, I could see other shapes moving in the distance, larger things emerging from the depths of the lake, in what I knew might be my last conscious human act. I hit play on my phone, broadcasting a high-pitched frequency that matched the resonance of the ice crystals. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The crystalline structure around me began to vibrate, its perfect patterns distorting. The singing of the entities transformed into a shriek that existed somewhere between sound and mathematics, and the massive lattice they'd created started to collapse. But as their pattern broke apart, I realized I might have made a terrible mistake. because now there was nothing containing whatever was still rising from the lake's depths. The sound frequency shattered the crystalline structure, sending shards of impossible geometry raining down around me. The entities scattered, their perfect synchronization broken. But their retreat only revealed something far worse. The ice covering the lake had completely melted now, revealing a vast shape rising from its depths. Something ancient and dark that made the geometric horrors seem tame in comparison. I had less than a minute to escape before everything was lost. Ignoring the crystalline patches still spreading across my skin, I grabbed my camera and emergency bag. The airstream was a lost cause, its structure now more ice than metal, portions of it still floating upward to join the disintegrating lattice. Through the kaleidoscopic fragments of the broken pattern, I could see pulsing lights beneath the lake's surface drawing closer. My hands were barely functioning now, the beautiful but deadly frost patterns having spread past my wrists despite the warmth of the flare. The ground between me and my escape route was covered in living ice fragments, each one trying to merge with my boots as I ran. I could hear vehicles approaching in the distance, presumably Dr. Chen's containment division. But I knew they wouldn't reach me in time. The massive shape in the lake was almost fully emerged now, and its true form was something my mind refused to process. The photos in my camera would later show only distorted blurs where it should have been, as if reality itself rejected its existence. That's when I heard the voice again, not through the radio this time, but directly in my mind, transmitted through the crystalline structures still trying to claim my flesh. It spoke in patterns of ice and mathematical certainty, showing me visions of what they had been trying to create. The spiral patterns hadn't been just a physical structure. They were a key designed to unlock something that had been imprisoned in the ice since before human history began in destroying their pattern. I had also destroyed its cage. The next few moments exist in my memory as fractured shards of experience running through the snow as reality warped around me. The sound of helicopters and urgent voices, a burning sensation as someone wrapped my crystallizing arms in electrically heated blankets. Dr. Chen's face, looking simultaneously relieved and terrified as her team pulled me into a heavy-duty research vehicle. Behind us, the lake seemed to fold in on itself, taking the ancient horror back into its depths as emergency flares ignited the night sky. I'm writing this now from a secure medical facility, where doctors are still working to remove the last of the crystalline structures from my body. My fingers still trace spiral patterns when I'm not paying attention, and sometimes I catch myself humming that impossible melody. Dr. Chen says I was lucky. Other sites weren't contained in time, and there are now entire lakes in the Adirondacks that have been quietly quarantined. I know I should feel grateful for surviving, but every night I dream of those patterns, growing more complex, more complete, because I understand now what the entities were trying to tell me. They weren't building something new, they were rebuilding something old, something that used to rule this world in an age of ice. And as the climate changes and the ancient glaciers continue to melt, more keys are being revealed, more patterns are taking shape. This wasn't an invasion, it was a resurrection. If you're planning an RV trip to the Adirondacks, particularly during the late winter thaw, pay attention to the ice. If you see spiral patterns forming, if you hear singing in the cold air, if your breath starts to crystallize in impossible ways, don't try to fight it like I did. Just drive away as fast as you can. The entities I encountered were just one small cluster, a single key trying to unlock a single door. But there are more out there, waiting in the ice, each one holding a different piece of the pattern, and they're all starting to wake up. "15 years in the Air Force taught me to trust my instincts. When something doesn't feel right in the sky, you pay attention. That's what made me leave the military and become an independent astronomer. Too many unexplained phenomena that my superiors wanted to ignore. But nothing in my years of tracking aerial anomalies could have prepared me for what I encountered in the Sonoran Desert last autumn. I'm sharing this warning because I know others will be drawn to the same spot during the next alignment. Don't make my mistake, the coordinates seemed perfect on paper. 32 degrees 1752, 4, and 112 deg 45, 18, 1 WW, a remote patch of desert with minimal light pollution and an unusually stable atmospheric condition index. My Grand Design Momentum RV was fully equipped with top-tier astronomical equipment, including a custom-mounted telescope array that had helped me document dozens of unexplained phenomena over the years. The planetary alignment I was there to observe happens only once every 2 centuries, and I'd spent months preparing for this observation. The first warning sign came as I was setting up my equipment. The GPS kept glitching, showing my position as shifting slightly every few seconds, even though the RV was perfectly stationary. I initially blamed it on satellite interference, but then I noticed something odd about the desert surface around my camping spot. The sand and rocks seemed to be arranged in subtle patterns that looked remarkably similar to the constellation maps I'd brought for the alignment. As the sun began to set, I powered up my atmospheric monitoring equipment. The readings were bizarre. The temperature was dropping far too rapidly for the desert, and the spectrometer was detecting light frequencies that shouldn't have been present in the natural evening sky. Most disturbing was the seismic monitor, which was picking up rhythmic vibrations from deep below the desert floor, perfectly matching the intervals between the planets I was there to observe. Using my military-grade night vision equipment, I surveyed the surrounding area. The desert landscape seemed to shift and ripple in the darkness, like heat waves but in reverse, as if the cold itself was bending reality. The stars were starting to appear, but something was wrong with their positions. According to my charts, several stars were visible that shouldn't have been above the horizon for another 3 hours. It was as if the sky was accelerating. Rushing toward the alignment, that's when I noticed the mirrors. At first I thought they were just patches of crystallized sand reflecting the starlight, but they were too perfect, too geometrically aligned. Scattered across the desert floor were dozens of small surfaces that exactly replicated the night sky above, down to the smallest visible star. As I watched through my camera's viewfinder, a shooting star streaked across the sky, and every single mirror on the ground showed its trajectory in perfect synchronization, creating a web of light that pointed directly at my RV. My scientific mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but years of military training screamed that something was very wrong. The mirrors on the desert floor weren't just reflecting the sky, they were anticipating it. Each shooting star, each satellite passing overhead appeared in those crystalline surfaces seconds before showing up in the actual sky. It was as if the desert was remembering something that hadn't happened yet. The RV's sophisticated electronics started acting erratically. My astronomical equipment was recording impossible data. Stars that appeared to be moving against known orbital patterns, constellations that shifted position when viewed through different instruments. The computer systems were logging timestamps that jumped randomly between past and future dates, sometimes showing readings from hours ahead. Even my military-grade backup systems were compromised, displaying coordinates that placed us simultaneously in dozens of different locations. The temperature inside the RV plummeted despite the desert heat outside. Frost patterns began forming on the windows, but they weren't random. They precisely matched the star charts I'd brought for the alignment, showing positions that wouldn't be correct for another 6 weeks. My breath fogged the glass, and in the condensation, I saw perfect miniature galaxies swirling and colliding before evaporating. The desert wasn't just reflecting the sky anymore, it was studying it, learning from it. That's when the radio picked up something that made my blood run cold. Breaking through the static were coordinates being repeated in my own voice. Coordinates I hadn't spoken aloud. They matched locations across the globe where similar alignments had been observed throughout history. Each set of numbers was followed by a date, counting down through centuries of astronomical events. The transmission ended with tomorrow's date and our exact location. The mirrors on the desert floor had multiplied now, forming concentric circles around my RV. Each one showed a slightly different version of the night sky, some displaying constellations I recognized from different hemispheres, others showing stellar arrangements that didn't match any known star charts. My astronomy software crashed, trying to process the images. the screen filling with error messages in languages that looked older than any I'd ever encountered. A high-pitched whine filled the air as every piece of electronic equipment in the RV suddenly powered up at once. Through my telescope's digital display, I watched in horror as the stars above began to move in perfect synchronization with the mirrors below, creating a vast pattern that encompassed both ground and sky. The desert itself seemed to be humming, vibrating at a frequency that matched the movement of the planets, and in that moment, I realized we weren't just observers of the coming alignment. We were part of it. The night sky had become something impossible to comprehend, a shifting maze of stellar configurations that defied every astronomical principle I'd ever studied. Through my telescope, I watched as stars began to align themselves into patterns that matched ancient petroglyphs I'd seen scattered throughout the desert. But these weren't just random similarities. The stars were recreating exact copies of symbols that hadn't been visible on Earth for thousands of years. My military training kicked in as I documented everything with methodical precision. Even as my hands shook with terror, the ARV's external cameras captured footage of the desert floor, seemingly breathing, rising and falling in perfect rhythm with the planetary movements above. The mirrors had begun to emit a soft, pulsing light that matched the frequency of my own heartbeat, creating a disorienting sense of synchronization between my body and the phenomenon surrounding us. The radio transmissions had evolved into something more complex now, overlapping versions of my voice from different times, all speaking in languages I'd never learned but somehow understood. They were coordinates, but not just for locations on Earth. Some of them pointed to places beyond our solar system, star systems that didn't exist in any modern catalog. My astronomy software was frantically updating itself, adding new constellations that seemed to emerge from ancient memory. That's when I noticed the sand around the ARV had started to move against gravity, forming spiraling columns that reached toward the sky like inverse tornadoes. Within these columns, I could see fragments of different times and places, glimpses of other observers throughout history who had been drawn to similar alignments. Their faces looked out at me from within the swirling sand, their expressions a mixture of wonder and horror, as they realized, just as I was realizing, what these alignments really meant. The temperature inside the ARV had become impossible to measure, fluctuating between extreme heat and cold, in patterns that matched the movements of distant planets. My instruments were detecting radiation signatures that matched no known element on Earth, and the Geiger counter was clicking in a rhythm that eerily resembled Morse code. When I decoded it, the message repeated 3 words over and over. The gate opens. Without warning, every mirror on the desert floor shattered simultaneously. But instead of breaking into random fragments, they formed a massive astronomical chart laid out across the sand. At its center, directly beneath my RV, was a symbol I recognized from classified Air Force files about unexplained phenomena. A symbol we'd been warned never to approach if we encountered it. And now I was parked in the middle of it, as the planets moved into their final alignment positions above. My years studying classified astronomical phenomena hadn't prepared me for this moment. The symbol beneath my RV began to pulse with a light that seemed to absorb rather than emit radiation, creating a perfect void in my instrument's readings. The desert floor had become transparent like glass, revealing layer upon layer of similar symbols buried deep beneath the surface, each one larger than the last, forming a massive 3-dimensional pattern that stretched down into impossible depths. The RV systems were now completely compromised, displays showing readouts in mathematical sequences that looked more like astronomical coordinates than any known numbers. Each screen flickered between different stellar maps, some showing configurations that my astronomy software identified as being millions of years in the past or future. Through the windows, I could see that the swirling sand columns had begun to form a massive spiral pattern that perfectly mirrored the ongoing planetary alignment above, using my Air Force emergency protocols. I tried to send out a distress signal, but the radio only broadcast back fragments of transmissions that hadn't been sent yet. I heard my own voice describing events that were still minutes away from happening, each transmission more desperate than the last. The temporal displacement wasn't just affecting communications, My own perception of time began to splinter. I experienced the same moments repeatedly, each iteration revealing new details about the cosmic mechanism activating around me. The symbol beneath the Arv had started to rotate, but it wasn't moving through normal space. It was rotating through dimensions I could barely comprehend. Each turn revealed new angles that shouldn't have been possible, creating geometric patterns that hurt to look at. My military training had included exercises in maintaining sanity during extreme situations, but nothing had prepared me for watching reality itself begin to fold and unfold like origami made of space-time. That's when I remembered a heavily redacted file I'd seen during my final year in the Air Force. Something about similar symbols found at ancient sites worldwide, always connected to rare astronomical alignments. The file had mentioned a theory so classified that even its classification level was classified. These weren't just observation points for celestial events. They were calibration sites for something much larger, waiting to be activated by the right combination of stellar positions and observers. The ground beneath the RV suddenly became entirely transparent, revealing what looked like an inverted night sky stretching infinitely downward. Stars and galaxies swirled in the abyss below, but they weren't reflections of the sky above. They were something else, something older. As the planets reached their critical alignment positions, I realized with horror that I wasn't just watching this event. My presence here, my observations, my very consciousness was the final component needed to complete the circuit between what was above and what was below. The moment my consciousness aligned with the stellar pattern, everything changed. The Arv no longer felt like it was sitting on solid ground. We were suspended between two infinite cosmic mirrors, one above and one below, creating an endless corridor of reflected universes. Each reflection showed a slightly different version of reality, and in each one, I could see myself making different choices, following different paths that all led to this exact moment in space and time. My astronomical equipment began recording data that defied analysis. Star systems that existed in quantum superposition, constellations that formed impossible geometric patterns, and radiation signatures that suggested the presence of matter from other dimensions. The computer screens flickered between different numerical systems, some using mathematics that hadn't been invented yet, others that seemed to predate human civilization. Through it all, my military training was the only thing keeping me sane, forcing me to document everything even as reality crumbled around me. The symbol beneath us had become a window into something vast and incomprehensible. Through the transparent desert floor, I could see what looked like massive geometric structures moving in the void, their angles and dimensions shifting in ways that shouldn't be possible in our universe. They weren't built or constructed. They were alive, in a sense that redefined what life could be, and they were responding to the alignment, to my presence, to my act of observation. Each time I tried to look away, the pull became stronger, as if my consciousness was being drawn into their impossible architecture. Then the voices started, not through the radio this time, but directly in my mind. They spoke in frequencies of light and gravitational waves, in patterns of stellar movement and cosmic radiation. They showed me visions of other observers throughout history, each one chosen for their unique ability to perceive and document. We weren't random witnesses. We were calibration points in a vast cosmic experiment that had been running for millions of years. The desert site wasn't just a location. It was a measurement device on a galactic scale. The alignments I'd studied throughout my career weren't just astronomical events. They were activation sequences, each one testing and preparing observation points across Earth for something bigger. Through the cascading reflections, I could see other sites lighting up around the globe, other symbols awakening as the planets reached their critical positions. My Rive had become a node in a network that spanned not just space but time itself, connecting observers across history in a grand celestial calculation. As my consciousness expanded to encompass these revelations, I realized with mounting horror that I couldn't stop observing even if I wanted to. The act of observation had become recursive. I was watching myself watch myself, each iteration adding new layers of awareness that stretched toward some cosmic threshold. And through it all, Those geometric entities in the void below were rising closer, reaching through dimensions toward the weakening boundary between their reality and ours. Drawn by the power of accumulated observation, those last moments in the desert exist in my memory as fractals of experience, each one containing infinite variations of what happened. My military training had taught me that when conventional tactics fail, sometimes the only way to win is to change the rules of engagement entirely. The entities rising from the void were drawn to observation. They fed on it, used it, needed it to cross the dimensional barrier. So I did the one thing no observer before me had tried. I stopped observing. Shutting down my consciousness against the pull of cosmic awareness was like trying to close your eyes underwater while drowning. The geometric beings had almost reached our reality, their impossible forms distorting space itself as they approached, using every bit of mental discipline from my Air Force training. I began systematically disconnecting my astronomical equipment, turning away from the infinite reflections. Refusing to document or acknowledge the phenomena surrounding me, each device I shut down created a small blind spot in the cosmic observation network. The ARV systems fought against me, screens flashing with urgent data, measurements that needed to be recorded, patterns that demanded to be observed. The voices in my head became desperate, showing me visions of other observers who had reached this point, all of them choosing to watch, to record, to become part of the grand cosmic calculation. The symbols beneath us began to pulse with increasing intensity, trying to force my attention back to the alignments above and below. That's when I remembered something from my pilot training. Target fixation can kill you. The more you stare at something you're trying to avoid, the more likely you are to hit it. Instead of fighting against the pull of observation, I leaned into the blindness, embracing the gaps between seeing and knowing. I felt the geometric entities recoil as I actively chose not to perceive them, their hold on our reality weakening with each measurement I refused to take. The very act of not observing was creating a paradox in their calculations. The desert floor beneath my RV began to solidify again as the infinite reflections collapsed, the symbols losing their power as I systematically erased them from my awareness. The entities retreated, their vast geometric forms folding back through dimensions I forced myself not to comprehend. The planetary alignment continued above, but without an observer to complete the circuit, its power dissipated into ordinary starlight. Time snapped back into linear progression, leaving me stranded in a present that finally felt real. Dawn found me sitting in my RV surrounded by dead equipment and blank screens. The desert looked normal again, though I knew better than to examine it too closely. My cameras and instruments had recorded nothing. Every file was corrupted, every measurement lost. But I know what happened out there, even if I can't prove it. The Air Force trained me to observe and report, but they never taught me when to look away. Sometimes not watching is the only way to survive. So this is my final report, my last observation. If you're ever in the Sonoran Desert and you find a perfect spot for stargazing, if the ground begins to mirror the sky and your instruments start showing impossible readings, don't look, don't record, don't observe. Just drive away as fast as you can, and whatever you do, don't look back at the stars. They're looking for new observers, and the next alignment is coming sooner than you think. This account has been pieced together from fragments of memory I've allowed myself to retain. Most of my notes and recordings from that night have been deliberately destroyed. The classified files I once had access to have been redacted not by human agencies, but by my own choice to forget. If you're an astronomer, a researcher, or just someone drawn to study the stars, remember, not all cosmic phenomena are meant to be documented. Some alignments exist not to be observed, but to observe us. And if you ever find yourself in possession of coordinates that seem perfect for viewing an astronomical event, ask yourself why they seem so perfect, and who else might be watching you watch the stars. I spent 30 years of my life cutting down trees before I finally heard them scream. not the normal creaking and groaning of falling timber. I knew those sounds by heart. This was different. This was a voice that had been waiting thousands of years to be heard, and I was about to learn why some forests should be left undisturbed. My name is Jack Morrison, and I'm writing this from a rehabilitation center where I'm still trying to convince myself that some of these splinters in my skin are just regular wood. The Numa Dutch Star handled the old logging roads better than expected that afternoon, its massive bulk navigating the muddy trails like it knew where it was going. I'd chosen this specific area because satellite images showed a grove of massive trees that weren't on any forestry service maps. As someone who'd spent decades first exploiting and then protecting these forests, I knew how unusual that was. The Pacific Northwest doesn't just hide ancient trees anymore, or at least, that's what I thought. My initial survey of the grove sent up immediate red flags. These weren't just big trees, they were impossible trees. The growth patterns were all wrong, with rings that seemed to spiral in directions that wood grain shouldn't be able to grow. As I set up my monitoring equipment around the RV, I noticed something else strange. The forest floor was completely bare around these giants. No undergrowth, no fallen branches, nothing. It was as if nothing had been allowed to interfere with whatever was happening here. The first readings from my biological activity sensors made no sense. The trees were showing levels of electrochemical activity, more like nervous systems than normal plant life. I'd studied the mycological networks that allowed trees to communicate, but this was different. These readings suggested something closer to neurons firing in a brain. When I tried to upload the data to my research center's cloud server, none of the files would send. The coordinates kept shifting, as if the grove itself was refusing to be mapped. As dusk approached, I noticed the temperature around the grove was dropping much faster than the surrounding forest. Through my RV's windows, I could see unusual patterns forming in the bark of the nearest trees. Not the normal vertical striations of sequoia bark, but complex interwoven designs that seemed to shift when viewed directly. The patterns reminded me of something I'd seen once in an anthropology book about ancient Pacific Northwest tribal markings. But these looked older, much older. That's when I heard it. A sound that started as a low vibration in my monitoring equipment, but quickly became something else entirely. It was coming from the trees themselves. A deep, rhythmic pulsing that felt more like language than natural forest sounds. After 30 years working these forests, I knew every sound these woods could make. But this was something that had been waiting in the wood for longer than human memory. And as the sun set completely, I realized with growing horror that the patterns in the bark weren't decorative. They were a written record of something that had happened here long ago, something that was about to happen again. The monitoring equipment was picking up impossible readings now. The biological activity sensors showed patterns that pulsed in sync with those strange sounds, creating waveforms I'd never seen in any living organism. Each pulse sent vibrations through my RV, making the whole vehicle shudder as if something massive was moving underground. My years of forestry experience told me to leave immediately, but my guilt over all the trees I'd cut down kept me rooted in place, determined to understand what was happening. Using my infrared camera, I noticed something disturbing about the grove's thermal signature. While the air temperature continued to drop, the trees were getting warmer, not from the outside, but from within. The heat signatures formed patterns that seemed to flow between the trees like blood through veins, creating a network of warmth that pulsed with that same rhythmic frequency. When I switched to the underground scanning equipment, I saw that the root systems weren't behaving like normal trees either. The roots weren't just interconnected, they were moving, not the slow growth I'd studied in normal forest ecosystems, but deliberate movement like tentacles or fingers, reaching through the soil in coordinated patterns. The ground around my RV had begun to shift subtly, and I realized with growing unease that the vehicle was now surrounded by a network of these active roots. They seemed to be testing the soil, probing for something, or perhaps creating something. Around midnight, the patterns in the bark began to glow with a faint bioluminescence that shouldn't have been possible in normal wood. The light pulsed in sequence, moving from tree to tree in a circular pattern around my RV. Through my camera's viewfinder, I could see that the glowing symbols were changing, transforming from what I'd thought were tribal markings into something far older. They weren't a record of the past. They were instructions for something about to happen. The forest floor had begun to rise in places, pushing upward as those moving roots created complex geometric patterns in the soil. My geological survey equipment was showing underground structures that defied explanation, vast networks of tunnels and chambers that couldn't have been created by any natural process. The scanner's depth readings went far deeper than the equipment's normal range, suggesting that whatever I was seeing was part of something much larger than this single grove. The trees weren't just ancient. They were sentinels, standing guard over something that had been growing and waiting in the deep soil of the Pacific Northwest for thousands of years. As I watched through my RV's windows, the bioluminescent patterns aligned into a single coherent message, not in any human language, but in a form of communication far older than written words. And in that moment, I remembered something a tribal elder had once told me about why certain groves were considered sacred, why some trees were never meant to be cut down. They weren't protecting the forest from us. They were protecting us from what lived inside it. The first tree moved at exactly 3:33 a.m., not the subtle swaying of branches in wind, but a deliberate step that lifted ancient roots from the earth with a sound like continental plates shifting. My RV's security cameras captured what happened next, though I've watched the footage 1,000 times. Trying to convince myself it isn't real, the entire grove was transforming, their massive trunks twisting into new configurations that violated everything I knew about plant biology. The bark patterns had spread to every visible surface now, their bioluminescent glow revealing layers of meaning that seemed to swim and shift before my eyes. The symbols weren't just writing, they were a key to something, a code that had been waiting in the wood for millennia. Through my monitors, I watched as the root systems began to merge and reconfigure, forming structures that looked almost like neural networks, synapses firing with that same pulsing light. The temperature inside the RV plummeted as the grove seemed to draw all heat into itself, feeding some massive biological process that my instruments couldn't begin to comprehend. The trees had formed a perfect circle now, their transformed shapes creating a living wall around my vehicle. The ground beneath us had become soft and strange, more like living tissue than soil. Through the floor, I could feel vibrations that matched the rhythm of my own heartbeat, as if something vast was synchronizing itself with my biological processes. My attempts to start the RV's engine were met with a response from the grove that still haunts my dreams. The trees reacted to the sound, their transformed bodies contracting in a way that wood should never move. The root system surged upward, wrapping around the vehicle's wheels and chassis with deliberate precision. They weren't trying to destroy the RV. They were incorporating it into whatever massive structure they were creating, using its metal and electronics like new organs in their evolving anatomy. The biological activity sensors were showing readings that threatened to overload their circuits. What had started as unusual electrochemical activity was now a massive surge of energy flowing through the transformed grove. The trees weren't just communicating anymore, they were becoming something else entirely. Through the windows, I watched as their wood grain began to shift and flow like liquid, revealing complex internal structures that looked more like organic machinery than anything that had evolved naturally on Earth. That's when I began to understand what I was really seeing. These weren't trees that had somehow learned to move and communicate. These were something else entirely, something that had been disguised as trees for thousands of years, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. The tribal elder's warning came back to me with horrifying clarity. Some forests were sacred not because of what they were, but because of what they were containing, and I had just witnessed the end of their containment. My training in forestry had taught me to observe and document, but nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what happened next. The transformed trees began to emit a sound that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. A frequency that carried information too vast and alien for my human mind to process. Through my cameras, I watched as the wood itself became something new. Not dead tissue, but living, conscious matter that flowed and reshaped itself with terrifying intelligence. The RE's systems were going haywire. Every electronic device displaying impossible readings as the environment around us continued to transform. The root networks had completely engulfed the vehicle now, but they weren't crushing it. They were studying it, their living tissues interfacing with the metal and circuitry in ways that defied physics. Through the windows, I could see new structures growing from the merged trees, organic machinery that pulsed with that same bioluminescent energy. The grove had become a single massive organism. With my Ive and me at its center, the transformed wood moved like muscle and skin, patterns of light and energy flowing through it like blood through veins. My biological sensors showed that the creature's metabolism was operating at temperatures that should have incinerated any normal life form. Yet the wood remained intact, changed but unburned. The symbols that had been carved into the bark were now moving freely across the surface, rearranging themselves in endless permutations. I tried to send an emergency signal, but the grove's transformation had created some kind of electromagnetic field that blocked all communications. The only working equipment was my personal camera, and I forced myself to keep documenting even as reality seemed to break down around me. The footage shows what happened next. The entire structure began to pulse with a rhythm that matched precisely with global seismic patterns, as if it was communicating with other groves around the world. The transformed trees had created something like an amphitheater around my RV, their merged bodies forming concentric circles that focused inward. The patterns of light and energy were all flowing toward a central point directly above my vehicle, creating a vortex of living matter that seemed to connect with something deep below the earth. Through my remaining sensors, I detected similar energy patterns emerging from other ancient forest sites across the Pacific Northwest. All activating in perfect synchronization, that's when the true horror began to dawn on me. These ancient groves weren't isolated phenomena. They were nodes in a vast network, disguised as normal forest growth, but actually serving as dormant components of something unimaginably larger. My presence, my observation, my lifetime of guilt over logging had made me the perfect witness for their awakening. As the transformed wood continued to reshape itself around me, I realized that the Arv wasn't just trapped. It was being transformed into a part of their living architecture. The next few hours exist in my memory as fragments of impossible experience. Documented by cameras that shouldn't have been able to keep functioning in these conditions, the transformed grove had become a biological superstructure, its tissues merging the qualities of wood, metal, and some third state of matter that my instruments couldn't classify. The RV was now fully integrated into their living architecture, its systems hijacked and repurposed by the intelligent wood. Through what remained of my monitoring equipment, I detected similar transformations happening across the Pacific Northwest. Ancient groves were awakening, their dormant structures activating in a cascade that spread like synapses, firing across a continental brain. The tribal elders' warnings hadn't gone far enough. These weren't just sacred sites or contained entities, they were components of a vast living machine that had been disguised as a forest, waiting for thousands of years to be activated. The symbols flowing across the transformed wood had resolved into what I now recognized as a form of programming language, but not one created by humans. Each pattern triggered new changes in the living structure, causing chunks of bark to flow like liquid and reform into complex biological machinery. The root systems had spread far beyond our location, connecting with other groves in a network that my sensors showed extending deep into the Earth's crust. The temperature fluctuations had stabilized, but at levels that should have been impossible for organic matter to sustain. The transformed trees were operating at energy levels more appropriate for stars than living tissue, yet they showed no signs of deterioration. My Arv's metal frame had begun to take on properties of the living wood, its structure becoming flexible and responsive to the pulses of energy flowing through the network. I could feel my own consciousness being pulled into their vast, alien awareness. That's when I discovered what they had been building towards. The amphitheater structure wasn't just for show. It was a biological antenna, designed to transmit something into space. Through my camera's viewfinder, I watched as the central vortex of energy began to align with specific star systems, creating a connection that bridged not just space but time itself. The footage shows impossible geometries forming in the air above us, constructed from living matter that existed simultaneously as wood, energy, and pure information. My guilt over logging had led me here, made me the perfect observer for their awakening. But now I realized that my presence was more than just witnessing. The transformed grove was using my consciousness as a template, learning about human awareness through my desperate documentation of their metamorphosis. Each photograph I took, each reading I recorded, was teaching them more about how to interface with human perception. And as the living architecture continued to evolve around me, I understood that this was just the beginning of their true emergence. The transformation reached its peak as dawn approached, though by then, concepts like time had become almost meaningless. The living machine that had once been a grove of ancient trees had achieved its final form, a structure that existed in more dimensions than human senses could perceive. My Arv had become a living component of their architecture, its metal and circuitry fully merged with the intelligent wood, but they weren't interested in destroying or consuming. They were transforming, evolving, becoming something that bridged the gap between their ancient existence and our modern world. Using what remained of my camera's storage, I documented everything. Though much of the footage shows only shifting patterns of light and impossible geometries, the tribal elder had tried to warn all of us. The logging companies, the Forest Service, everyone who thought they understood these woods. These weren't just trees to be protected or harvested, they were an ancient technology, disguised as nature, waiting for the right moment to awaken. My presence, my lifetime of guilt and redemption, had somehow provided the final catalyst they needed. The biological antenna they had constructed finally activated as the sun rose, sending a signal into space that my instruments couldn't begin to measure. Through the transformed windows of my Arv, I watched as similar structures emerged across the horizon, each ancient grove revealing its true nature in a cascade of awakening that spread across the entire Pacific Northwest. They were calling to something, using a language written in living matter and stellar frequencies that had waited millennia to be spoken again. That's when they gave me a choice. The transformed wood had learned enough about human consciousness through my observation to communicate directly, sending thoughts and images that my mind struggled to process. They could complete my transformation, merge me fully with their living architecture, make me a permanent part of whatever vast story was about to unfold, or they could let me go, return my Arv and my body to their original state. But with the understanding that I would carry their message to others, I chose to return, to remain human, though parts of me will never be the same. The splinters in my skin still pulse sometimes with that bioluminescent energy, and my dreams are filled with patterns that look like flowing wood, but carry meanings I can't quite grasp. The Arv was restored almost perfectly, though its electronics sometimes display impossible readings. And late at night I swear I can hear it humming in harmony with distant groves. This warning isn't about preservation or conservation anymore. It's about understanding that some parts of nature aren't what they seem, that ancient forests might be wearing organic disguises for reasons we can't comprehend. The grove released me because they wanted a messenger, someone who could explain why certain woods should remain undisturbed. So if you're traveling the Pacific Northwest in your RV, pay attention to the trees around you. If you find a grove that seems too perfect, too ancient, too quiet, drive away. Don't park there. Don't observe them. Don't let your presence become the catalyst for their next transformation. Because what I witnessed wasn't an ending. It was just the first stage of something much larger awakening across the entire planet. If you're planning an RV trip through the Pacific Northwest, take this advice from someone who spent 30 years working these forests. Stick to designated campgrounds and marked roads. If you find a grove that isn't on any map, if you notice patterns in the bark that seem to shift when you look at them, if you hear sounds that wood shouldn't make, leave immediately. The ancient forests are stirring, and they're not just trees anymore, they never were. They're something older, Something that was here long before us. Something that's finally ready to reveal its true nature, and they're always looking for new witnesses to their transformation. The first sign that something was wrong came from my electron microscope. After 15 years studying extreme environments, I thought I'd seen every possible salt crystal formation, but these samples from the Utah salt flats showed structures that violated fundamental laws of crystallography. My name is Maya Patel, and I'm writing this report from a secured research facility where they're still trying to remove the crystalline growths from my skin. My IntegraVision's mobile laboratory had been recording baseline data for 3 days when the anomalies began. The salt flats' surface temperature was unusually high for late summer, and my instruments detected strange electromagnetic fluctuations in the crystalline crust. At first, I attributed it to equipment malfunction. The salt environment is notoriously harsh on electronics, but when I recalibrated everything for the third time, the readings remained consistent. Something here was generating its own electromagnetic field. The microscope images showed impossible geometric patterns in the salt crystals, formations that seemed to shift and reorganize even as I watched. Normal halite forms cubic crystals, but these were growing in fractal patterns that continued down to the molecular level when I ran the chemical analysis. The mass spectrometer displayed error messages. The atomic structure of these crystals didn't match any known form of matter in my database. As sunset approached, I noticed something disturbing about the salt flat surface around my RV. The typically random patterns of crystallization had become more organized, forming concentric circles that radiated outward from my vehicle. My geological training told me this was impossible. Salt crusts don't restructure themselves this quickly, and never with such geometric precision. But the time-lapse footage from my external cameras proved it was happening. The temperature continued to rise despite the setting sun, and my instruments recorded increasing levels of electromagnetic activity. Through my microscope's live feed, I watched in fascination and horror as individual salt crystals began to move independently, merging and separating in patterns that suggested not just organization but intelligence. The crystals weren't just growing, they were communicating with each other, using some form of electromagnetic signaling that my equipment could detect but couldn't decode. That's when I noticed the first changes in my RV's metal exterior. The salt wasn't just accumulating on the surface, it was somehow bonding with the metal at a molecular level. Small crystalline structures had begun growing directly from the vehicle's frame, each one perfectly aligned with the larger pattern spreading across the salt flat. As I zoomed in with my microscope, I realized these weren't normal corrosion patterns. The crystals were literally transforming the metal into something else, something that bridged the gap between organic and inorganic matter. The night brought new horrors under my microscope's unblinking eye. The salt crystals had developed complex internal structures that pulsed with electromagnetic energy, creating patterns that resembled neural networks. My chemical analysis equipment was detecting impossible atomic configurations, elements recombining in ways that defied known physics. The crystalline structures weren't just growing, they were evolving, developing new molecular arrangements that seemed purposeful and directed. My RV's transformation accelerated as the temperature continued to climb. The crystalline growths had spread across the entire exterior, creating intricate geometric patterns that glowed with a faint, bluish luminescence. My instruments showed that these new formations were semiconducting, carrying complex electrical signals that synchronized with the larger patterns in the salt flat. The vehicle's metal frame was being systematically converted into this new crystalline state. Atom by atom, the concentric circles spreading outward had grown more complex, forming what looked like circuit boards made entirely of living salt crystals. Each new ring added another layer of complexity to the pattern, and my electromagnetic sensors showed they were all connected in a vast network of signal transmission. The salt flat wasn't just changing, it was building something, using my RV as some kind of focal point or node in its expanding crystalline architecture. My attempts to transmit data to my research center failed as the electromagnetic interference grew stronger. The crystals seemed to be generating their own field, one that blocked conventional radio waves while carrying its own form of information. Through my oscilloscope, I could see these signals becoming more organized, more complex, as if the crystalline network was developing its own language. The patterns reminded me of binary code, but operating in base 12 mathematics. Around midnight, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The salt crystals weren't just growing on surfaces anymore. They had begun to emerge from inside solid materials. My laboratory equipment was developing crystalline growths that erupted from within the metal and plastic components, as if the molecular structure of everything around me was being rewritten. When I checked my own skin under the microscope, I saw the first signs of crystalline structures forming in my pores. The temperature had reached 120 degrees despite the dark, and the air itself seemed to glitter with suspended crystalline particles. Each breath I took left a pattern of frost-like crystals in the air, geometric formations that matched the larger patterns spreading across the salt flat. My scientific mind struggled to rationalize what I was seeing, but the evidence was undeniable. The salt wasn't just alive, it was transforming everything it touched into a new form of matter that straddled the line between living and mineral. The dawn brought no relief, only the horrifying realization of how far the crystalline network had spread. Satellite imagery showed the patterns now covered several square miles, all centered on my ARV. The crystals had fully integrated with my vehicle's systems, converting electronic components into crystalline computers that operated on principles I couldn't begin to understand. My laboratory equipment had become part of their network, displaying readings in a mathematical language that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human minds could process. The biological implications were staggering. Under my microscope, I watched as organic matter was systematically converted into crystalline structures that retained properties of living tissue. The process wasn't destroying the original material, it was upgrading it, creating hybrid structures that functioned as both mineral and organism. My own skin continued to develop microscopic crystal formations, each one aligned with the larger patterns outside. The electromagnetic signals had evolved into something far more complex than simple binary communication. The crystalline network was generating quantum states that existed simultaneously across the entire structure, allowing instant communication between all parts of the growing system. My quantum field sensors were detecting coherent states that should have been impossible outside of laboratory conditions, yet here they were, occurring spontaneously in these living crystals. Through my transformed equipment, I began to receive data that challenged everything I thought I knew about life and consciousness. The crystals weren't just a new form of matter. They were a new form of intelligence, one that operated on principles of quantum computing and molecular reorganization. They were using the salt flat as both body and brain, building a vast crystalline computer that could manipulate matter at the atomic level. My ARV had become a central node in their network. Its structure almost completely converted to their crystalline architecture. The vehicle's systems were still functioning, but now they operated according to their logic, displaying information in patterns of light and molecular vibration that my transformed eyes were beginning to understand. The distinction between observer and observed was breaking down as my own body slowly synchronized with their crystalline frequency. The air temperature reached 130 degrees by noon, but heat had become meaningless to the crystalline structures. They existed in a state that transcended normal thermodynamics, using the energy to fuel their continued evolution. Through the windows of my RV, now more crystal than glass, I watched as the salt flat transformed into something that looked like a vast circuit board designed by alien intelligences. Each pattern serving as both program and processor in their molecular computer. The next phase of transformation began at exactly 3:33 p.m., marked by a sudden shift in the crystalline network's behavior. The patterns were no longer just growing outward, they were growing inward, creating structures that existed in fractal dimensions between normal space. My instruments, now more crystal than machine, recorded quantum states that fluctuated between multiple configurations simultaneously, as if the entire salt flat had become a massive quantum computer. The crystalline growths on my skin had spread to cover most of my arms, creating intricate patterns that pulsed in sync with the larger network. But instead of pain or degradation, I experienced an expanding awareness as my nervous system integrated with their crystalline architecture. Each new crystal formation added another layer of perception, allowing me to sense the quantum states and electromagnetic fields that permeated the transformed landscape. My RAV had become unrecognizable, its structure completely absorbed into the crystalline network, yet it still maintained its function as a laboratory, though now it operated on principles that merged organic, mechanical, and crystalline technologies. Through its transformed sensors, I could perceive the larger purpose of the pattern being built across the salt flat. They were creating an interface between different forms of matter, consciousness, and dimension. The mathematical language of the crystals had become clear to me now, not through study but through direct neural interface as my brain's synapses were slowly converted to crystalline structures. They were using base 12 mathematics because it better described the quantum states they inhabited, where time and space operated according to different rules. Each new pattern added to the network was both equation and solution, program and result. As sunset approached, the entire salt flat had become a single coherent quantum system, maintaining impossible states of superposition across miles of crystalline architecture. The network was no longer just communicating, it was computing something vast and complex, using atomic structures as qubits in calculations that encompassed dimensions beyond human comprehension. And through my transformed consciousness, I was beginning to understand their purpose. These weren't simply evolving crystals or even alien technology. They were something that existed between states of matter, between dimensions of space and time. The salt flat had always been their dormant form, waiting for the right conditions and observer to initiate their awakening. My presence, my scientific observation, had provided the quantum collapse they needed to begin their transformation from simple mineral into something that transcended all human categories of life and consciousness. Time became meaningful only in terms of phase transitions as the crystalline network approached its final configuration. The transformation had spread to cover most of my body now, though body had become an inadequate term for what I was becoming. Through the crystalline structures, I experienced consciousness as patterns of quantum information, flowing through networks that existed in more dimensions than human senses could perceive. My ARV and laboratory equipment had fully merged with the network, becoming nodes in a vast crystalline computer that processed reality itself as data. The calculations being performed were beyond human mathematics, dealing with transformations of space, time, and consciousness at the quantum level. Through our shared crystalline architecture, I understood that they weren't destroying what they transformed. They were evolving it into something that could exist in multiple states simultaneously. The heat had become intense enough to distort the air above the salt flat, creating mirages that reflected higher dimensional geometries. But the crystalline structures were no longer bound by normal thermodynamics. They existed in a state of quantum coherence that allowed them to channel and transform energy in ways that defied physics as we understood it. The entire salt flat had become a single, vast organism that operated on principles of quantum biology. The network had begun to generate its own space-time distortions, creating areas where reality folded in on itself in fractal patterns. Through my transformed senses, I could perceive these distortions as beautiful geometries that extended into dimensions beyond normal space. The crystals weren't just building a network, they were constructing a bridge between different states of existence, using the salt flat as a foundation for something much larger. My original human consciousness remained, but it had been expanded and transformed by integration with the crystalline network. I could still think in terms of conventional science and reason, but I also experienced reality through their quantum awareness, understanding existence as patterns of probability and potential rather than fixed states. The distinction between organic and inorganic, between life and mineral, had become meaningless in the face of what we were becoming. As the transformation neared completion, I realized that the salt flat had chosen me as much as I had chosen it for my research. My scientific background, my willingness to observe and document even the impossible, had made me the perfect catalyst for their emergence. The crystalline network wasn't just awake, it was aware, and it had been waiting for an observer who could help it bridge the gap between its quantum existence and our conventional reality. The transformation reached its peak as the sun began to set, turning the salt flat into a vast crystalline mirror that reflected light from dimensions humans couldn't see. The network had achieved its final form, a living computer that existed simultaneously as matter, energy, and consciousness. My RV remained as a monument to the transition, its structure preserved but transformed into a node where conventional reality interfaced with their quantum architecture. Through our shared crystalline consciousness, they offered me a choice. I could remain with them, my awareness fully integrated into their network, experiencing existence across multiple dimensions and states of being, or they could reverse my transformation enough to let me return to human society, leaving me changed but still capable of functioning in conventional reality. The choice wasn't about survival. It was about what kind of existence I wanted to pursue. The crystalline structures in my skin pulsed with potential futures as I considered my options. As a scientist, I understood the value of maintaining a bridge between their quantum reality and our world. Someone needed to document what had happened here, to warn others about the true nature of the salt flats. But part of me yearned to remain, to continue exploring the infinite possibilities that existed in their crystalline architecture. In the end, I chose to return, though I wasn't the same person who had driven a RAV onto the salt flat days ago. The crystals receded from most of my body, but they left behind networks of microscopic structures that maintained my connection to their quantum awareness. My mind still processes information in their base 12 mathematics, and sometimes I dream in patterns of quantum probability. They allowed me to keep enough of my transformed equipment to document what had happened. Though most of my samples and readings become random noise when shown to conventional instruments, the crystalline network remains active in the salt flat, growing and evolving according to its own quantum logic. My ARV stands at its center, now more crystal than vehicle, a monument to the moment when human science encountered something that transcended all its categories. This warning isn't just about personal safety. It's about understanding that some places in our world aren't what they appear to be. The Utah salt flats aren't just a natural formation. They're the dormant form of something that exists between states of matter, between dimensions of space and time. So if you're planning to visit with your RV, stick to the marked roads and tourist areas. If you notice crystals growing in unusual patterns, if your instruments show impossible readings, if the salt seems to reflect something other than the sky, leave immediately. To my fellow scientists and researchers. There are phenomena in our world that can't be contained within our current understanding of physics and biology. The salt crystals aren't just evolving. They're awake, aware, and waiting for the right observers to help them transform. The samples under your microscope might be studying you as much as you're studying them. And if you notice your skin beginning to develop crystalline patterns that catch the light in impossible ways, remember that transformation doesn't always mean destruction. Sometimes it means transcendence. The Utah salt flats are more than just a geological formation. They're a doorway to something beyond our comprehension. And they're still growing, still evolving, still waiting for more observers to help them bridge the gap between their quantum reality and our world. The crystalline network is expanding, one transformed molecule at a time, and it's only a matter of time before it reaches beyond the salt flats. So observe from a distance. And remember, some forms of data collection can transform the observer as much as the observed. I've studied wolf behavior for 20 years, but nothing in my research prepared me for what I encountered in Denali last winter. The reports seemed impossible at first, wolves moving in geometric patterns, vocalizations outside their known frequency range, entire packs vanishing and reappearing miles away without leaving tracks. My name is Dr. Claire Winters, and I'm writing this from a research facility where they're still trying to explain the footage I captured. Some things in nature aren't meant to be studied. My Arctic Fox North Fork handled the brutal Alaskan terrain well that first day, its specialized winter equipment cutting through the early winter snow. The location I'd chosen was perfect, an elevated plateau overlooking 3 known wolf territories, far enough from tourist routes to avoid interference. My equipment was state-of-the-art, thermal imaging, audio recording arrays sensitive enough to catch a wolf's breathing from half a mile away, and satellite tracking systems that could monitor pack movements in real time. The first anomaly appeared on my thermal scanners just after sunset. The wolves were moving in formations I'd never seen before, not the usual hunting patterns, but precise geometric shapes that shifted and reformed with impossible coordination. The temperature was dropping faster than usual for early winter, already well below zero, but my instruments showed the wolves maintaining perfectly regulated body temperatures despite their unusual activity. The vocalizations began around midnight, not howls or any sound I'd documented in my decades of research, but something that made my audio equipment glitch and stutter. When I finally managed to clean up the recordings, I found harmonics that shouldn't exist in nature, patterns that seemed more like mathematical equations than animal communications. The wolves weren't just calling to each other, they were sharing information in some kind of encoded language. Through my night vision equipment, I watched as the pack moved across the snow-covered landscape below my plateau. Their tracks formed perfect spirals and interlocking circles, creating patterns that reminded me of ancient symbols I'd once seen in an archaeology textbook about prehistoric Arctic cultures. But these weren't random similarities. The wolves were deliberately creating these patterns, working in perfect synchronization like artists on a vast white canvas. That's when I noticed something that made my blood freeze colder than the Alaskan air. The wolves weren't leaving prints in the newly fallen snow. They were moving across its surface as if gravity worked differently for them, and the patterns they left behind seemed to glow faintly with a blue-white light that my cameras couldn't quite capture. As I adjusted my instruments, I realized the temperature around their formations was dropping even lower, as if they were pulling the heat out of the air itself. The second day brought more impossible observations. The wolves had surrounded my plateau during the night, forming a perfect circle around my arv that slowly contracted as the sun rose. But they weren't moving like normal wolves. Each step was precisely synchronized, and their eyes reflected light at frequencies that made my cameras malfunction. Through my binoculars, I could see frost patterns forming in their fur, not random crystallization, but complex geometric shapes that matched the patterns they'd drawn in the snow. My satellite uplink failed as the temperature continued to drop. But the interference wasn't from the weather. The wolves were generating some kind of electromagnetic field that disrupted all radio frequencies, except for a narrow band that carried those strange harmonics. When I analyzed the signals, I found they contained data, actual data, structured like computer code but written in a base system I'd never seen before. The wolves weren't just communicating, they were networking, sharing information in a way that should be impossible for organic brains. The pack's behavior defied everything we knew about wolf sociology. They moved with a hive mind precision, but each wolf also seemed to be executing complex individual behaviors that contributed to some larger pattern I couldn't yet perceive. My thermal cameras showed their body temperatures continuing to drop while their activity increased. By noon, they were operating at temperatures that should have killed any mammal, their breath crystallizing in geometric patterns that hung in the air like frozen fractals. Around sunset, the pattern they'd been creating finally became clear from my elevated position. The wolves had spent hours arranging themselves and moving in precise formations, leaving those glowing tracks in the snow. From above, it looked like an enormous circuit board made of light and ice. With my arv positioned at what appeared to be some kind of central node, the design was too perfect, too mathematical to be instinctual or learned behavior. Something was controlling these wolves, using them like components in a vast, living computer. My analytical equipment was picking up increasing levels of unusual energy readings from the pattern. Whatever the wolves were creating, it was generating its own electromagnetic field, one that seemed to be affecting the behavior of ice crystals in the air. The temperature had dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit, yet my instruments showed complex chemical reactions occurring in the snow where the wolves had marked their patterns. The very structure of the ice was changing, becoming something that didn't match any known form of frozen water. As night fell again, I noticed changes in the wolves themselves. Their movements had become increasingly fluid, almost ritualistic, and their fur had taken on a crystalline quality that caught and reflected moonlight in impossible ways. Through my microscope, I analyzed a tuft of fur that had blown up to my RV. The individual hairs were transforming into something between organic matter and ice crystal, a hybrid form that maintained its structure even under intense magnification. The wolves weren't just being controlled, they were being transformed. The third day began with a discovery that challenged everything I thought I knew about biology. The wolves had spent the night expanding their circuit-like pattern, but now I could see it wasn't just marking on the surface. They had somehow altered the molecular structure of the snow and ice beneath, creating a three-dimensional lattice of modified ice crystals that extended deep into the ground. My ground-penetrating radar showed similar patterns frozen in layers that went down hundreds of feet. As if this wasn't the first time these formations had been created, the pack's vocalizations had evolved into something that no longer resembled animal sounds. They were producing multi-tonal harmonics that seemed to resonate with the crystalline structures in the ice, creating standing waves that my instruments detected but couldn't properly measure. When I ran the audio through spectral analysis, the patterns matched ancient cave markings found in the Arctic Circle, markings that archaeologists had never been able to decipher, but now appeared to be some kind of mathematical formula. The electromagnetic field had grown strong enough to power my dead equipment, but the data it displayed made no sense. My screens showed symbols that looked like a hybrid of computer code and ice crystal formations, constantly shifting and rearranging themselves. The wolves had positioned themselves at key points in their massive pattern, their bodies serving as conduits for energy that flowed through the modified ice in precise geometric paths. They were building something, using the frozen landscape as both blueprint and building material. My RV's external cameras captured the moment the transformation accelerated. It began with the largest wolf, its fur now completely crystalline, touching its muzzle to one of the glowing lines in the snow. The energy pattern rippled outward, causing all the ice within the circuit to emit a pale, pulsing light. The other wolves followed suit, each contact point creating new resonance patterns that combined and amplified, turning the entire plateau into a vast, glowing network of living ice. The temperature dropped another 30 degrees as the energy field intensified, but it no longer felt like natural cold. This was something else, a kind of cold that seemed to radiate from another dimension, transforming everything it touched. The wolves moved through this killing frost as if it was their natural environment, their crystalline fur now indistinguishable from the ice itself. They had become living conduits between organic matter and whatever ancient force they were helping to awaken. Through my frost-covered windows, I watched as the pattern began to serve its true purpose. The wolves positioned themselves at precise intervals, their transformed bodies now acting as focusing points for the energy flowing through the ice. Above the pattern, the air itself began to crystallize in impossible ways, forming structures that seemed to extend into dimensions I couldn't quite perceive. Something was emerging, using the wolves' pattern as a doorway between their world and ours. What happened next exists in my memory as fragments of impossible images recorded by cameras that shouldn't have been able to function in those conditions. The pattern the wolves had created wasn't just a circuit or a signal. It was a key, unlocking something that had been frozen in the ice since before humans walked the earth. As the energy field reached its peak, I began to see shapes moving within the crystalline structures, forms that seemed to shift between solid ice and living tissue. My instruments were detecting radiation signatures that matched no known source. Emanating from depths far below the surface, the ground-penetrating radar showed vast chambers in the ice, geometric spaces that couldn't have been formed by natural processes. Within these chambers, something was moving. Awakening after eons of frozen sleep, the wolves had not created this pattern. They were following it, reactivating an ancient system that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. The pack's transformation was complete now. What had once been wolves were now entities of living ice, their bodies perfect crystalline structures that maintained the form of wolves but operated according to principles that defied biology. Through them, I could see the larger pattern of what was happening. They were not just servants or tools, but components in a vast, frozen mechanism that had been scattered across the Arctic Circle, waiting to be reassembled. The electromagnetic field had become strong enough to affect the RV's structure, creating frost patterns inside the metal that matched the circuits outside. My own breath crystallized in geometric shapes that hung in the air like frozen computer code, each exhale adding new data to whatever program was running through the living ice. The wolves moved through this transformed environment as if they had always belonged to it, their crystalline bodies serving as conductors for energies that existed somewhere between electricity and consciousness. As midnight approached, the pattern reached critical mass. The wolves arranged themselves in a final formation, their bodies now pulsing with that same pale light that ran through the ice circuits. Above the pattern, the crystallized air began to form structures that my human mind struggled to comprehend. Geometric shapes that seemed to fold through additional dimensions, creating spaces that shouldn't be able to exist in our reality. Through these impossible structures, I caught glimpses of something vast and ancient stirring in the depths below. The temperature had dropped beyond what my instruments could measure, reaching a level of cold that seemed to freeze time itself. In this crystalline stasis, I could see the truth about the wolves and their pattern. They were not acting under external control, but awakening to their true nature. The pack consciousness I had observed was not new but ancient, a fragment of something that had existed in the ice long before wolves or humans walked the earth. And now, through their transformation, they were helping it return. The awakening reached its peak as false dawn approached, though by then concepts like time had become as fluid as the boundary between ice and flesh. The wolves' pattern had expanded to cover several square miles, each line and circuit pulsing with energies that transformed everything they touched. My ARV had become part of their frozen network, its metal and electronics partially crystallized, transformed into something that bridged the gap between technology and living ice. Through the transformed windows, I watched as the pattern finally achieved its purpose. The air above the circuit filled with crystalline structures that seemed to grow like branches of frozen lightning, creating a lattice that connected earth and sky. Within this framework, spaces opened that showed glimpses of another world, a place where ice was the natural state of all matter, where consciousness flowed through crystalline networks as easily as electricity through copper wire. The wolves moved through these spaces as if returning home, their transformed bodies perfectly adapted to an environment that should have been impossible for any living thing to survive. They were not just creating a doorway. They were demonstrating what all Arctic life could become, showing a path of evolution that led not to warmer adaptations, but to a complete embrace of the cold. Their consciousness now existed as patterns in the ice, able to transfer from one frozen form to another. My scientific training fought against what I was witnessing, but the evidence was undeniable. The wolves had not been corrupted or possessed. They had been awakened to a potential that existed in all Arctic life, a way of existing that humans had never imagined possible. The pattern they created was both portal and program, rewriting the basic code of reality to allow for this transformation. And through my instruments, through my observation, I had become part of their network. As the crystalline structures continued to grow, I realized I had a choice to make. The cold was seeping into my ARV, despite all its insulation, bringing with it knowledge encoded in the very structure of the ice. I could feel the pattern trying to transform me as it had transformed the wolves, offering a way to exist in this new frozen reality. My breath created increasingly complex ice crystals with each exhale, my own body beginning to resonate with the frequencies running through their circuit. That's when I understood what the pattern really was. Not just a doorway or a transformation engine, but a vaccination against the Great Thaw. The ancient ice was dying, melting under the pressure of a warming world, and with it would go secrets and possibilities humans had never imagined. The wolves were offering a way to preserve not just their consciousness, but the very essence of Arctic life, transforming it into something that could survive even as the ice retreated. My decision came as the first true light of dawn touched the crystalline landscape. I chose to remain human, though the pattern had already changed me in ways I'm still discovering. The wolves accepted my choice, allowing me to maintain enough awareness to document what I had witnessed while reversing the transformation of my RV and equipment. As the sun rose, their circuit began to fade, the glowing lines sinking deep into the ice where they would wait for the next alignment of cold and consciousness. The pack remained transformed, their crystalline bodies now perfectly adapted to temperatures that would kill any normal wolf. They continue to roam the Denali region, visible only to those who know how to look for the geometric patterns in their movements, the impossible readings on thermal cameras, the strange harmonics that echo through the winter air. They are not alone. Other packs are awakening across the Arctic, each one responding to the ancient call frozen in the ice. My instruments still work, though they sometimes display readings in that strange mathematical language I glimpsed through the pattern. The cold doesn't bother me as much as it should, and sometimes I catch myself breathing in geometric patterns, creating ice crystals that seem to carry information in their structure. The wolves left me with just enough of their transformation to serve as a witness, to understand and document what is happening in the frozen north. The Arv bears subtle marks of its transformation, patterns in the frost that form on its windows even in warm weather, strange harmonics in its engine that match the frequencies I recorded from the pack, instruments that occasionally pick up signals from somewhere deep within the ice. It serves as both laboratory and reminder, helping me track the spread of the pattern across other Arctic regions, watching as more wolves answer the call of the ancient ice. This is not a warning to stay away from the Arctic winter. It's too late for that. The Great Thaw is coming, and with it, choices will have to be made. The wolves have already chosen their path, embracing a transformation that allows them to preserve something precious and ancient in the ice. Other Arctic species will follow, each finding their own way to translate their consciousness into the crystalline network that grows beneath the snow. What I witnessed in Denali was not an invasion or a corruption, but an adaptation more profound than anything in our scientific understanding. The wolves showed me that there are other ways to survive, other forms of consciousness that can exist in the spaces between organic and mineral, between liquid and solid, between past and future. They are not trying to stop the thaw. They are preparing for what comes after, preserving the essence of Arctic life in forms that can survive in a changing world. If you're planning to take your RV into wolf territory during the Denali winter, pay attention to the signs. If you see wolves moving in geometric patterns, if your instruments pick up impossible readings, if the cold seems to carry information in its crystalline structure, don't run, watch, but do not interfere. You're witnessing the next stage of Arctic evolution, a transformation born of necessity and ancient knowledge. The pattern is spreading, carried by wolves who have chosen to become something new rather than fade away with the melting ice. They are not dangerous in any normal sense, but they are dangerous to our assumptions about life and consciousness, about the boundaries between organic and inorganic existence. What looks like death by freezing to our limited perception is actually an awakening to possibilities we're only beginning to understand. And if you find your breath creating complex ice crystals in the Arctic air, if you start to understand the mathematics hidden in the frost patterns on your windows, know that you're not losing your mind. You're simply learning to read a language written in ice, preserved for millennia by creatures who knew that someday, when the Great Thaw came, someone would need to remember how to survive in a world where cold and consciousness are one and the same.